She stood at the gates of the most expensive mansion in Beverly Hills, soaking wet, begging for scraps of food. The billionaire inside had no idea he was looking at the woman who could destroy his entire empire. This is the story of how one desperate woman's midnight visit exposed a conspiracy 15 years in the making and brought down one of America's most powerful men. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the people we ignore are the ones who hold our fate in their hands. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Tonight, we're going to uncover a truth so shocking that it will make you question everything you think you know about justice, revenge, and the price of greed. What you're about to hear is the true account of Rebecca Martinez, a former Wall Street executive who spent 3 years living on the streets of Los Angeles, planning the most elaborate takedown in corporate history. Her target was Thomas Anderson, a tech billionaire worth $14 billion who had destroyed her family and thought he had gotten away with it forever. This isn't just a story about homelessness or corporate fraud. This is a story about what happens when someone with nothing left to lose decides that justice is worth more than survival. To understand how Rebecca Martinez ended up at Thomas Anderson's gate that rainy October night in 2023, we need to go back to 2008, when she was living a completely different life. Rebecca was 32 years old, the youngest female partner at Goldman Sachs, and she was making more money in a single year than most people see in a lifetime. She lived in a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, drove a Ferrari, and wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's rent. But more importantly, she was the primary caretaker for her father, Miguel Martinez, a brilliant software engineer who had immigrated from Mexico in the 1980s with nothing but a dream and an extraordinary talent for coding. Miguel had built a small but incredibly successful cybersecurity company called SecureNet, and by 2008, major corporations were paying millions for his proprietary encryption software. Rebecca had used her Wall Street connections to help her father expand the business, and together they had built something remarkable. SecureNet was on the verge of going public, with an estimated valuation of over $500 million. Miguel Martinez, the immigrant who had arrived in America with $20 in his pocket, was about to become one of the wealthiest Hispanic entrepreneurs in the country. But Miguel's success had attracted the attention of Thomas Anderson, who at the time was a rising star in Silicon Valley, known for his aggressive acquisition tactics and his ability to identify promising startups before they became household names. Anderson's company, TechVault, had built its empire by acquiring smaller companies, often through methods that walked the fine line between shrewd business and outright theft. Anderson had a particular talent for finding companies that were family-owned or led by immigrants, people who might not have the same connections or legal resources to fight back when things went wrong. He had been watching SecureNet for months, studying their technology, their business model, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. Anderson knew that if he could get his hands on Miguel's encryption software, he could integrate it into TechVault's existing products and potentially dominate the entire cybersecurity market. The software was worth hundreds of millions, possibly billions, but Anderson didn't want to pay market price for it. He wanted to take it, and he had developed a plan that would allow him to do exactly that, while making it look completely legal. In December 2008, Anderson approached Miguel with what seemed like a generous partnership offer. TechVault would provide $50 million in funding to help SecureNet expand internationally, and in return, Anderson would get a 30% stake in the company and a seat on the board of directors. For Miguel, who had been bootstrapping his company for years, the offer seemed like a dream come true. The partnership would give him the resources to compete with major corporations while maintaining control of his life's work. Rebecca was initially skeptical. Her Wall Street experience had taught her to be wary of deals that seemed too good to be true. But Anderson's reputation in Silicon Valley was impeccable. He had successfully partnered with dozens of companies, and many of them had gone on to become major successes. After months of negotiations and legal reviews, Miguel signed the partnership agreement in March 2009, officially bringing Thomas Anderson into SecureNet as a minority partner and strategic advisor. For the first 6 months, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Anderson provided valuable business connections, helped SecureNet land several major contracts, and even assisted with recruiting top talent. Miguel's company was growing faster than ever, and the public offering was still on track for early 2010. Rebecca watched her father's dreams coming true and began to think that maybe she had been too cautious in her initial assessment of Anderson. But what neither Miguel nor Rebecca knew was that Anderson had been using his position on the board to systematically steal SecureNet's intellectual property. He had installed spyware on the company's servers, copied thousands of proprietary files, and had his own engineers reverse engineering Miguel's encryption algorithms. More devastatingly, Anderson had been using his access to SecureNet's financial records to identify the company's biggest vulnerabilities and most valuable assets. He was planning to destroy Rebecca Martinez professionally and personally, and he was doing it from the inside. The first sign of trouble came in September 2009, when Miguel discovered that several of SecureNet's major clients had mysteriously canceled their contracts and signed with TechVault instead. When Miguel confronted Anderson about the coincidence, Anderson claimed that it was simply market competition and that these things happened in business. But Rebecca's Wall Street instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She hired a private investigator to look into TechVault's recent product launches and discovered something that made her blood run cold. TechVault had just released a new cybersecurity suite that was virtually identical to SecureNet's proprietary software, but it was being sold at half the price and was somehow even more advanced than the original. It was as if someone had taken Miguel's work, improved upon it, and then undercut him in his own market. When Rebecca presented her findings to her father, Miguel was devastated but not entirely surprised. He had been noticing small signs that something was wrong, files that had been accessed when no one was supposed to be in the office, meetings that Anderson had requested but then canceled at the last minute, and questions about technical details that seemed oddly specific. Miguel confronted Anderson directly, demanding to know how TechVault had developed software that was so similar to SecureNet's proprietary technology. Anderson's response was calm, calculated, and absolutely chilling. He told Miguel that ideas couldn't be copyrighted, that similar solutions to similar problems were bound to emerge in a competitive market, and that if Miguel had concerns about intellectual property theft, he was welcome to pursue legal action. But Anderson also made it clear that such action would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile, because TechVault had the resources to fight a legal battle that would bankrupt SecureNet long before any resolution was reached. Rebecca Martinez was trapped, and Anderson knew it. SecureNet's contracts were disappearing, their technology had been stolen and was being sold by a competitor with vastly superior resources, and their primary investor was the person who had orchestrated the entire scheme. Miguel tried to buy out Anderson's stake in the company, but the partnership agreement included clauses that made such a buyout prohibitively expensive. He tried to find new investors, but Anderson used his influence in Silicon Valley to poison the well, spreading rumors that SecureNet was facing intellectual property lawsuits and was not a safe investment. Within 6 months, SecureNet went from being a thriving company worth hundreds of millions to a struggling startup that couldn't pay its employees. Miguel was forced to lay off most of his staff, including engineers who had worked with him for over a decade. The stress was enormous, and it was taking a devastating toll on his health. Rebecca watched her father's life's work being systematically destroyed, and she was powerless to stop it. Her Wall Street connections couldn't help because Anderson's influence in the tech industry was too strong. Her legal resources were insufficient because TechVault's lawyers were some of the best in the country. Every move she made to help her father was countered by Anderson's superior resources and connections. It was like fighting a war where the enemy had unlimited ammunition and she was armed with a slingshot. The worst part was watching what the stress was doing to Miguel. He was losing weight, barely sleeping, and had developed a persistent cough that he couldn't shake. The man who had built a company from nothing, who had achieved the American dream through pure determination and brilliance, was being systematically destroyed by someone who had the power to steal his life's work and make it look legal. By early 2010, SecureNet was facing bankruptcy, and Miguel was facing something even worse. Anderson had begun spreading rumors that Miguel had been embezzling money from the company, using forged financial documents that made it appear as though Miguel had been funneling company funds into personal accounts. The accusations were completely false, but they were sophisticated enough to trigger an SEC investigation that froze SecureNet's remaining assets and made it impossible for Miguel to operate his business. Anderson had not only stolen Miguel's technology and destroyed his company, he had also made it appear as though Miguel was a criminal who had betrayed his own investors. The psychological warfare was devastating, and Miguel began to believe that he would never be able to clear his name or rebuild his reputation. The stress, the shame, and the feeling of helplessness were overwhelming, and Miguel Martinez began to consider options that no parent should ever have to think about. On March 15, 2010, Miguel Martinez drove to the Golden Gate Bridge at 4 a.m. and took his own life. He left behind a note explaining that he couldn't live with the shame of what Anderson had done to him, and that he hoped his death would somehow clear his name and allow Rebecca to rebuild their family's reputation. The note also contained detailed documentation of Anderson's theft and fraud, but Miguel knew that even with evidence, Rebecca would never have the resources to fight someone as powerful as Thomas Anderson. Miguel's death was reported in the tech industry press as the tragic end of an entrepreneur who had been unable to cope with business failure and legal troubles. Anderson released a statement expressing his condolences and his shock at the accusations in Miguel's suicide note, calling them the desperate fantasies of a man who had been struggling with mental health issues and business failures. Rebecca Martinez's world collapsed completely. She had lost her father, her family's company, and her faith in justice all in the span of 18 months. The SEC investigation continued even after Miguel's death, and the frozen assets meant that Rebecca couldn't even afford to give her father a proper funeral. She was forced to sell her penthouse apartment, her car, and most of her possessions just to pay for legal fees and basic living expenses. Her career on Wall Street was over because the scandal had made her radioactive in the financial industry. No major firm would hire someone whose family was under federal investigation for embezzlement, even if the charges were obviously fabricated. Within a year of her father's death, Rebecca Martinez had gone from being a wealthy Wall Street executive to being unemployed, nearly homeless, and completely alone in the world. But the worst part wasn't the financial ruin or the career destruction. The worst part was knowing that Thomas Anderson had murdered her father, as surely as if he had pushed him off that bridge himself, and that he was going to get away with it completely. Anderson's theft of SecureNet's technology had made TechVault billions of dollars over the following years. The cybersecurity software that Miguel had spent decades developing became the foundation of Anderson's empire, generating revenue that eventually made him one of the richest men in America. Meanwhile, Miguel Martinez was remembered, if at all, as a failed entrepreneur who had committed suicide rather than face the consequences of his own criminal behavior. The injustice was so complete, so absolute, that it drove Rebecca to the edge of her own breakdown. For 2 years after her father's death, Rebecca Martinez struggled to rebuild her life, but every job application was rejected, every business venture failed, and every attempt to clear her father's name was blocked by Anderson's legal team and public relations machine. She had become a non-person in the business world, someone whose very existence was an inconvenience to powerful people who wanted the Miguel Martinez story to be forgotten. By 2012, Rebecca was living in a studio apartment in Queens, working as a waitress and spending every spare moment researching Thomas Anderson and looking for some way to expose what he had done. She had boxes of documents, recordings of phone calls, and detailed timelines of Anderson's theft. But none of it mattered because she didn't have the platform or the resources to make anyone listen. The breaking point came in 2013, when Rebecca discovered that Anderson was about to receive a humanitarian award from the Hispanic Business Association for his mentorship of minority entrepreneurs. The irony was so cruel, so obscene, that Rebecca finally understood that the system would never deliver justice for her father. If she wanted Anderson to pay for what he had done, she would have to make it happen herself, and she would have to be willing to sacrifice everything, including her own life, to make it happen. That night, Rebecca Martinez made a decision that would consume the next decade of her life. She was going to destroy Thomas Anderson, and she was going to do it in a way that would make him understand exactly what he had taken from her family. Rebecca Martinez spent 6 months planning her transformation from failed Wall Street executive to invisible homeless woman, and the process was more methodical and deliberate than anything she had ever done in her professional life. She studied homeless populations in major cities, learning about survival strategies, social services, and most importantly, how to become the kind of person that wealthy people literally don't see. She practiced changing her voice, her posture, her mannerisms, until she could completely disappear into the role of someone who had never had power or privilege. She sold everything she owned, closed all her bank accounts, and destroyed every piece of identification that connected her to her former life. In December 2013, Rebecca Martinez officially ceased to exist, and a homeless woman named Sarah began living on the streets of Los Angeles. The first year of homelessness was the most difficult experience of Rebecca's life, but it was also the most educational. She learned that homeless people are essentially invisible to the wealthy and powerful, that they can observe and overhear conversations that would never happen in front of someone who mattered. She discovered that homeless people often do odd jobs for rich families, cleaning houses, doing yard work, running errands, and that these jobs provide access to private spaces and personal information that would be impossible to obtain any other way. Most importantly, she learned that Thomas Anderson had a pattern of hiring homeless people for temporary work at his various properties, and that he had a particular mansion in Beverly Hills where he conducted his most sensitive business meetings. For 3 years, Rebecca lived on the streets, slowly working her way into Anderson's orbit through a network of other homeless people who did occasional work for his household staff. She learned his schedules, his habits, his security protocols, and his personal vulnerabilities. She discovered that Anderson had continued his pattern of stealing from smaller companies, that he had destroyed at least a dozen other entrepreneurs in the same way he had destroyed Miguel Martinez, and that he had accumulated evidence of his crimes in a personal safe at his Beverly Hills mansion. More importantly, she learned that Anderson kept detailed records of his illegal activities because he used them as leverage against business partners and political allies who might otherwise cause problems for his empire. Rebecca also discovered something that gave her the final piece of her revenge plan. Thomas Anderson suffered from severe insomnia and often worked alone in his home office during the early morning hours, usually between 2 and 5 a.m. During these sessions, he would review sensitive documents, make private phone calls, and conduct business that he didn't want his regular staff to overhear. The mansion's security system was sophisticated, but it was designed to keep intruders out, not to monitor what happened inside once someone had been given legitimate access. If Rebecca could find a way to get inside the house during one of Anderson's late-night work sessions, she would have access to evidence that could destroy him and the opportunity to confront him with the truth about what he had done to her family. The plan that Rebecca developed was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its complexity. She would present herself at Anderson's gate during a rainstorm, when visibility was poor and emotions ran high, and she would appeal to whatever vestige of humanity he might still possess. She would offer to work for food, to clean his house in exchange for a meal, and she would hope that his ego and his need to feel superior would make him allow a desperate homeless woman into his private space. Once inside, she would plant recording devices, copy financial documents, and gather evidence of Anderson's crimes over the past 15 years. But more importantly, she would confront him with the truth about Miguel Martinez and make him understand that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his own wealth and power. October 23, 2023, was the night that Rebecca Martinez had been planning for over 10 years, and every detail had been rehearsed dozens of times. She had been monitoring Anderson's schedule for months, and she knew that he would be alone in his Beverly Hills mansion that night, working on a major acquisition that required absolute secrecy. She had also been tracking weather patterns, and she knew that a major storm was expected to hit Los Angeles that evening, providing the perfect cover for her approach. At 11:30 p.m., Rebecca positioned herself at Anderson's gate, soaking wet from the rain, carrying a small backpack that contained recording equipment, lock-picking tools, and copies of every document she had collected about her father's death. When Anderson's voice came through the intercom, Rebecca almost lost her nerve. She hadn't heard his voice in over 13 years, but it was exactly the same, calm and confident, and utterly without empathy. She asked for work, for food, for any small kindness that he might be willing to show to someone who was obviously desperate and harmless. For a moment, she thought he was going to refuse, that her entire plan would collapse before it even began. But then Anderson surprised her by opening the gate and telling her to come to the front door. Later, Rebecca would realize that Anderson's decision to let her in had nothing to do with kindness or charity. He was curious about what kind of person would approach his house in the middle of a storm, and his ego demanded that he demonstrate his power over someone who was clearly powerless. When Rebecca entered Thomas Anderson's mansion, she was struck by how much it looked like a museum dedicated to wealth and power. Every surface was covered with expensive art, awards, and photographs of Anderson with celebrities, politicians, and business leaders. The message was clear. This was the home of someone who had conquered the world and wanted everyone who entered to understand his superiority. Anderson looked older than Rebecca remembered, but he still carried himself with the same arrogance that had made him so dangerous 15 years earlier. He led her to the kitchen and told her that she could clean for a few hours in exchange for food and $20, but that she would need to be gone before his staff arrived in the morning. For the first 2 hours, Rebecca cleaned Anderson's house while he worked in his home office, and she used the time to plant recording devices in key locations and to photograph documents that were left on desks and tables. Anderson's carelessness with sensitive information was shocking, but it made sense when Rebecca realized that he had never faced consequences for any of his actions. He had become so accustomed to operating with impunity that he had stopped taking basic precautions to protect himself. Rebecca found contracts that proved Anderson had stolen technology from at least 20 different companies, financial records that showed he had bribed government officials, and personal notes that revealed he kept detailed files on the entrepreneurs he had destroyed, including a folder labeled Miguel Martinez, Suicide Success. When Rebecca found that folder, she had to lock herself in a bathroom for 10 minutes to avoid screaming. The folder contained photographs of Miguel's funeral, copies of newspaper articles about his death, and handwritten notes from Anderson celebrating the fact that the Martinez problem had been permanently solved. Anderson had not only murdered her father, he had enjoyed it, and he had kept souvenirs of his victim's destruction like trophies. The cruelty was so absolute, so inhuman, that Rebecca realized she was dealing with someone who was fundamentally different from normal people, someone who experienced other people's suffering as a form of entertainment. At 3:15 a.m., Rebecca made her move. She walked into Anderson's home office, closed the door behind her, and sat down in the chair across from his desk. Anderson looked up from his computer, surprised but not yet alarmed, and asked what she needed. Rebecca removed her rain-soaked hood, looked Thomas Anderson directly in the eyes, and said, "My name is Rebecca Martinez, and you killed my father." The color drained from Anderson's face, but to his credit, he didn't deny it or try to pretend he didn't know what she was talking about. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smiled slightly, and said, "I wondered if you would ever show up. I have to admit, I'm impressed. This is quite an elaborate revenge fantasy." What happened next was a conversation that Rebecca had been rehearsing for over 10 years. But nothing could have prepared her for the reality of sitting across from the man who had destroyed her family and hearing him speak about her father's death as if it were a successful business transaction. Anderson admitted everything, not because he felt guilty or wanted to confess, but because he enjoyed explaining how clever he had been and how completely he had outmaneuvered everyone who had tried to stop him. He told Rebecca that Miguel Martinez had been a brilliant engineer but a terrible businessman, and that his technology was always going to end up in the hands of someone who knew how to monetize it properly. Anderson claimed that he had actually done Miguel a favor by giving him a few years of prosperity before taking what was rightfully his. Anderson also revealed details about his theft of SecureNet's technology that Rebecca had never known, including the fact that he had been planning to steal Miguel's work from the moment he first heard about the company. The partnership offer, the investment, the board seat, all of it had been a carefully orchestrated plan to get inside SecureNet and extract everything of value. Anderson had even hired psychologists to help him understand Miguel's personality and vulnerabilities, so that he could manipulate him more effectively. The level of premeditation and calculation was staggering, and it made Rebecca realize that her father had never had a chance against someone who was willing to invest that much time and resources in destroying him. But the most devastating revelation came when Anderson told Rebecca that Miguel's suicide had been the intended outcome from the beginning. Anderson had studied other entrepreneurs he had targeted, and he had learned that driving them to suicide was more effective than simply bankrupting them, because dead people can't fight back or seek revenge. Anderson had deliberately used psychological warfare tactics designed to push Miguel towards self-harm, and he had monitored Miguel's mental state to ensure that the pressure was applied at exactly the right moments. Miguel Martinez hadn't just been murdered, he had been systematically tortured to death by someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Anderson's final insult was his offer to buy Rebecca's silence. He told her that he admired her dedication and creativity, and that he would be willing to pay her $10 million to disappear and never mention her father's name again. He said that $10 million was more money than Miguel Martinez had ever seen in his entire life, and that it would allow Rebecca to live comfortably for the rest of her days. All she had to do was sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away from her quest for justice. Anderson genuinely seemed to believe that everyone had a price, and that Rebecca's response was to pull out a digital recorder and inform Anderson that their entire conversation had been broadcast live to FBI offices in Los Angeles, New York, and Washington, D.C. She had spent 3 years learning about surveillance technology and had equipped herself with devices that could transmit audio and video in real time to multiple locations simultaneously. Everything Anderson had said, every admission of guilt, every detail about his crimes, had been recorded and was already in the hands of federal investigators. Anderson's face went white as he realized that his arrogance and his need to gloat had just provided law enforcement with everything they needed to destroy him. Within 6 hours, FBI agents had surrounded Anderson's mansion and were executing search warrants that allowed them to seize every document, computer, and electronic device on the property. The evidence that Rebecca had gathered during her years of preparation, combined with Anderson's recorded confession, provided investigators with the most comprehensive picture of corporate fraud that they had ever seen. Anderson's empire began to collapse immediately. As business partners distanced themselves, investors demanded their money back and government contracts were canceled. The man who had seemed untouchable just hours earlier was suddenly facing the possibility of life in prison. Rebecca Martinez walked out of Thomas Anderson's mansion at sunrise on October 24, 2023. And for the first time in 13 years, she felt like she could breathe freely. Her father's name was finally going to be cleared. Anderson was going to face justice for his crimes, and the other entrepreneurs he had destroyed were going to have their stories told. The plan had worked perfectly, but the cost had been enormous. Rebecca had sacrificed her career, her health, her relationships, and 13 years of her life to achieve this moment. She had become someone she barely recognized, and she had done things that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But Miguel Martinez had been avenged, and sometimes that has to be enough. Thomas Anderson was arrested 3 days later and charged with conspiracy, fraud, embezzlement, and accessory to murder in the deaths of 4 entrepreneurs who had committed suicide after he destroyed their companies. His trial lasted 8 months and resulted in a conviction on all charges and a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. His fortune was seized by the government and used to compensate the families of his victims, including a $50 million settlement for Rebecca Martinez. Anderson died in federal prison 2 years later, reportedly from a heart attack, but some sources suggest that he took his own life rather than face the remainder of his sentence. Rebecca Martinez used her settlement money to establish a foundation that provides legal assistance to entrepreneurs who are being targeted by larger corporations, and she has become an advocate for stronger protections against corporate theft of intellectual property. She still lives quietly, still struggles with the psychological scars of her years on the streets, and still wonders whether the price of justice was worth everything she sacrificed to achieve it. But Miguel Martinez's name has been cleared, his story has been told, and his daughter finally found a way to make the powerful face consequences for their actions. Sometimes, that has to be enough. Sometimes, Justice is worth everything it costs to achieve it, even when the cost is almost too much to bear.